everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Women in Youth Ministry podcast. My name is Heather Kennison, and today our guest is Sydney Twichell. Sydney has been working in children's and youth ministry for almost a decade. Sydney currently resides in Texas, where she served as a youth pastor in the United Methodist Church up until 6 months ago. She's now working on combining ministry with film to connect youth to their faith using entertainment. So, Sydney, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And Sydney, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about who you are that is unrelated to ministry or unrelated to anything I just read about you.
Okay, so a very random fact about me that throws people off is I am a trained professional Jedi as well as ministry.
What? Is that a thing?
So it's a thing. So there is a organization called the Saber Guild. They're part of the Lucasfilm licensed groups, and they're a cosplay group that goes out to charity organizations and events and such, and they do a lot of philanthropy work. And what they do is they dress in the costumes that are approved by Lucasfilm licensing, as well as lightsabers, and they go out and they perform the actual Jedi battles in person in live. And so I am trained to be a part of that organization. I'm unfortunately not part of it yet because towards the end of my training, I got in a severe car accident that messed everything up. And so now that I'm kind of back on my feet, I can rejoin. But I have a lightsaber. I have a Sith costume. I'm a Sith. And so, yeah, that's a really weird fact about me.
That is amazing. I love that. That is not what I expected. Do you have any hot takes as far as Star Wars goes?
I think Padme should have gone for Obi-Wan instead of Anakin. I'm gonna say it now for everyone to hear. I feel like, why would you go for this whiny teenage boy when Ewan McGregor is right there? I don't get it. And I still love the movies and everything. It's kind of like one of those things I say to annoy my boyfriend when we're watching Star Wars. But yeah, that's a controversial take that I have that many people don't like.
I love it. I love it. What is one random bucket list, one random dream or goal that you have?
I really want to go to Scotland. My family history and lineage is very Scots-Irish. I know what clan we came from and all of that. And I just think Scotland's this beautiful country, and I don't want to be that annoying American when they go. So I want to be familiar with the culture before I go. But I do have dreams of going to Scotland at some point when I'm older.
That's really cool. Do you want to hear a random dream of mine?
Sure.
I want to open a breakfast place called It's All Gravy, where we serve gravy on biscuits and chicken fried steak.
Heck yeah.
And every day there's sausage gravy, there's a non-meat gravy, then there's a gravy du jour, okay?
Yeah.
Where it's maybe it's mushroom gravy, maybe it's chorizo gravy, maybe it's brown gravy. Who knows? Every day it's different. Yeah. And we make the best
gravy
biscuits.
Of the day.
Yeah. We make the best biscuits, we make the best chicken fried steak, and we have other things too, but when you come, you're coming for gravy. And it's called It's All Gravy.
That sounds so good. You should come up with a recipe for a sweet gravy.
Ooh, they do make a chocolate
Put it over
gravy.
Dessert. Yeah.
Here's the thing. I'm a good cook. I make a terrible restaurant manager. So this is just if I win the lottery, I'm going to open my restaurant and then just hire people to manage it. And I'm just going to eat there every day and be fat and happy.
I mean, yeah, that sounds like the ultimate dream.
All right. Well, now that we've got a chance to get to know you a little bit more, today we're going to talk a little bit about church abuse. And so this is definitely a difficult topic, and I definitely want to do a disclaimer for people listening that if you have experienced church abuse or are currently experiencing church abuse, this might be a great episode for you. It might also bring up some stuff for you. So I just want you to be aware of this as we start talking about this. So the reason I invited Sydney to be on the podcast is because I connected with her on Twitter, which your handle is like nerdy youth pastor. So
Yeah.
now hearing about how you're a trained Jedi, it makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. um,
Yeah.
but I've seen Sydney have a whole lot of spicy takes about church and church leadership, which is so up my alley. I love spicy takes and have them as well. And was definitely drawn towards some of the things that you were talking about. And I'd love for you to just have a chance to share, why are you passionate about calling out the toxicity that happens in church leadership?
Yeah, so I experienced some of that toxicity in church leadership and church abuse. I was groomed in the church, and it was kind of a under the table employment situation where the guy that was grooming me was being paid under the table to help like take care of the sets and clean the church and everything, but he wasn't an official employee. He wasn't on staff. So that was a very interesting time for me. But as I've gotten older, I've noticed that there's more and more church leadership issues and church abuse. And not only does it harm our witness, but it actively harms people. We're
Mhm.
supposed to be, the light of Christ is sitting on the hill. We're supposed to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And we're not doing that if we don't actively call out the people in our community who are actively using their power and experience and influence to hurt others. And so I think it's very important to be calling these things out, even if it feels minor to others.
Mhm. Yeah. Even if it makes people feel uncomfortable, it's really important to talk about these things. I just finished a book called A Church Called Tove. Have you read this book?
I've heard about it.
Hmm. It uses Willow Creek and the abuse or the sexual harassment that Bill Hybels um,
Mhm.
did. And it uses that as kind of like a case study for understanding church abuse. I had previously read the book Raised to Stay, and that's very hot right now. A lot of people are reading that, and I thought it was a good book. It was for people in ministry who have experienced church hurt, and it's kind of a plea for them to stay, if not in ministry, at least in faith. And I thought it was a really
Mhm.
good read for me, having just come out of church abuse. But I felt like there was this missing nuance of like there's church hurt and then there's church abuse. And those
Yes.
are two different things. So, what happens if you've experienced abuse? How then do you respond? And so that was when I read A Church Called Tove. And the way that it reads, it was like a playbook for what I had experienced, minus the sexual abuse.
Mhm.
It was more relational abuse of power,
Yeah.
abuse of position, and so I definitely recommend that to anyone listening. So we think of church, it's supposed to be a safe space, it's supposed to be the safest space that you could possibly go into, um
Yeah.
but it's often not. Why?
I think it's because there is an expectation that it's supposed to be safe. There is an expectation that whoever is going there, whoever is working there, whoever's in leadership there is a safe person, which means we are not preparing for the idea that it's not safe.
Mhm.
And when we're not prepared, that's when predators will come in. So predators go for easy targets, and churches, and I've said this to church leadership before at churches I've worked at, and it's like startled them. I actually had a woman clutch her pearls when I said this. But churches tend to be a predator's playground because no one's expecting a predator to go there. And so when they do go there, they can kind of slip under the radar, and no one's actively looking for predators when you're at church because it's church. We're talking about Jesus. We're the hands and feet of the community. We're giving people, homeless people bread, like stuff like that, and they don't think about someone could be coming in for malicious intent.
Mm. Absolutely. So, we both have Methodist backgrounds, and safe sanctuaries is the big policy
Yeah.
for youth protection in the UMC. And I was over the policy in my last church, and one of the things that we would tell people is that screening people is your first barrier, but the most important barrier is actually supervision,
Yep.
because there are a lot of abusers who will pass the screening process. But if you don't, but if you have proper supervision, then predators will be scared away, and um, and abuse is less likely to happen with proper supervision.
Yeah.
So you experience grooming. What are some signs of grooming of a young person?
Mm. So, some signs of it are if they get very close to particularly an adult in their life who starts having a lot of influence over their decision making. So
Mm.
one of the things that a predator will tend to do when they're grooming, it's like the second step in grooming when you look on rain.org, is they gain access, but they also isolate the victim immediately. And so one way that they can do this, and it's not just like with a much older person and a child, when it comes to these predators, it can also be seen in a lot of romantic relationships like dating or marriage. I know
Mhm.
someone right now who is watching her friend kind of get isolated by her new husband, and it's very startling for her. But the isolation process is basically they're telling the victim that no one else cares about them. They're sowing seeds of discontent. They're lying to them. And so for me, like with my grooming process, it was, your parents wouldn't understand our relationship. And, the pastor uh doesn't trust you like he should, and all of that stuff and everything, to like be who you are. And so by sowing seed of discontent, not only do you um convince the victim that nobody cares about them and they have to be with the predator in order to be loved, in order to have that connection with somebody, but you also make it feel impossible for them to leave when they realize they're in an abusive relationship, because now they feel like they don't have a support system. I can't go to my mom. If I were to tell her about all of this, she wouldn't believe me, or she would blame me, and so a lot of this with students, especially with students when they are groomed by a predator, um, they're immediately isolated because it makes it harder for them to leave. It makes it harder for them to come to a trusted adult like us to tell the trusted adult, I feel unsafe in this relationship, because they just think that no one's going to believe them. So
Mm.
that's a big one. And they also try and gain access. So the fastest way to gain access to a student nowadays with all of this technology that we have is through social media. And so a big boundary that is crossed many times in youth ministry, particularly, is friending the student on Facebook, following them on Twitter, Instagram, adding them on Snapchat, and then eventually it gets to the point where they have the student's phone number so they can text them and call them whenever they want, and kind of monopolize their time that way.
Mm. I'm rewatching Degrassi right now.
Yeah.
I love Degrassi. And the very first two episodes are about, and it's crazy because the show was like made in 2000 or something. Um,
Yeah.
and the very first two episodes are about this 12-year-old Emma, and she develops a relationship with somebody online through like email, I think. And
Yeah.
she's like, oh, it's like he can read into my soul. And then they realize actually he's just learned how to hack your email, because
Yeah.
like your hint to your password is what's my mom's favorite band, and that's not that hard. Yeah, that's not that hard to figure out.
Yeah.
And he's been reading all your emails and then regurgitating things back to you, and that's how he has access to you.
Mhm.
And so there's definitely like those predators. um but then there's also people who are really great human beings. Likely, I like to believe that people are at their core good people, but
Yeah.
they find themselves in these situations without proper supervision, and their boundaries and their barriers break down little by little, and all of a sudden they find themselves in these situations that they never intended to be in. They never intended to develop inappropriate emotional or physical reaction, but here they are. And now all of a
Oh,
sudden
absolutely.
they're committing heinous acts and are on a sex registry. But if they had had
Yeah.
proper supervision,
Hmm.
if they had had co-leaders and had, followed protections or guidelines for youth safety, they might never have been in that situation. And I know that's probably a hot take, because I think most people want to believe that like that all people who do bad things, it's because they prayed. But I do think that there are some people they didn't intend to get there, but they did get there because of
Yeah.
lack of supervision.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that at play because when you're not training your leaders, it can definitely it can go south really quick. And also some of the like leadership training that's like old fashioned or out of date are grooming practices. And
Yes.
so one of the churches that I worked at, because I've worked at several at this point, and one of the churches that I've worked at, they were training their leaders and I was at a much minor role. I was in an internship position, and the directors of the youth ministry were like my grandparents' age, and they had been doing youth ministry forever. And some of the leaders they were training were former youth kids of theirs, and they're going through the training, and it's like things they're instructing their leaders to do things that are grooming tactics. It's things like share a secret about yourself so that they share one with you. So you
Ooh.
have that bond. Yeah, like something like that. And it was crazy. And then you also have ones where it's like, if there's a kid that's shy and doesn't want to talk, keep talking to them because eventually like their boundary will wear down. They said that. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. And I was like, well, hopefully these leaders are like not dumb enough to follow these rules. And then I had lunch with one of the girls who grew up in their youth group and she was around my age. And we were meeting each other for the first time ever. This is my first interaction with this person. And she immediately starts talking about the abortion she had 2 years ago in detail. And I was not ready for that at all. I was not expecting that. And I'm totally fine with trauma dumping. I've done that before too, but this was not trauma dumping. She went into extensive detail about her abortion and then looked at me and said, "So what skeletons do you have in your closet?" And I was like,
Oh, hell.
um, I don't really have any skeletons in my closet. I think I gotta go. And it was like this really awkward, like uncomfortable thing. And I thought maybe she just did it with me because I was one of the leaders, but then I found out she did it with my younger sister too, who was in high school. She was like a junior in high school during this. And so when that
No.
happened, I was like, no, don't do that. And so I don't think she had any malicious intent. I really don't, but she thought this was the way you build a relationship with a student, and it's not. And sometimes students don't understand also that you have a boundary with them. I At one of the churches I worked at, had this student, I had this group of students. There was like this almost clique that was super close with each other, and they really liked me and would like to hang out with me. And one of them got my phone number and texted me one day, and it was at the end of a very long day where I had a doctor's appointment with some bad news and I was feeling bad. And he sent me a meme. And I laughed at it and I thanked him for sending me the meme. And it wasn't until 2 days later that I realized that I started a conversation with this student in private over text. And so I immediately had to knock that out. I got my boss to be in a group chat with the three of us and immediately went to the parents. His dad was the youth or the pastor of the church, like the whole pastor. So I was like, I immediately went to the pastor's wife and was like, hey, I just want to let you know that Rylan did text me. So um I did not mean to start a private conversation with your teenage son. And I will not have a private conversation with your teenage son anymore.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay. So two things came to mind. This is a really spicy take. Are you ready?
Yes.
Why is it that male youth pastors, when giving their testimony to youth, the sin that is in their testimony, you know where I'm going with this, right? What
I
is
know
it
exactly
always?
where you're going.
What is it
It's
always?
always some sort of sexual impropriety like pornography, or I had sex when I was a teenager and I regret it. Oh, it's always that, isn't it?
I would never
Always.
say that. I would never say that.
I would never share any sort of like stories I had of like lusting or anything like that with students. Like, I'm very cautious about that because, and that goes into, that's another grooming tactic that people
Mhm.
don't realize. And I think, and this really segues into like a main point that I talk about all the time is churches and distinctively purity culture almost pre-grooms students before
Yes.
the predator gets there. So
Yes.
when the predator gets there, they're already half baked in a way, like they're ready to go. And one of the grooming tactics is making students almost comfortable with sexual topics that they shouldn't know about, and it's in particular sharing sexual stories that you have about yourself. And so when youth pastors do that, every time I'm like, please stop, please stop. Like, they don't need, that's like, that's something you talk about with like college students after they've graduated high school who are struggling with the same thing. That's not something you talk about from the pulpit to a room full of teenage boys and girls, because they do it to boys and girls. I
Mhm.
remember many when I was in a youth group, I was going to like these summer camps, and I remember one guest speaker specifically talking about how hot his future wife had to be,
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
sexy she had to be. He even went into detail of like when she falls asleep, her fake lash is like fluttering in her sleep. Like, he went into detail about it. It was weird. It was
About a
like he went to be
future
a
wife?
supermodel, future wife, not current wife, future wife. And what's interesting is I found him on Facebook like 2 months ago. He's not a Christian anymore. He's not a pastor anymore. He hangs out with a bunch of supermodels in Vegas. But I'm just sitting here like, I listened to this man at 12 and 13 tell me how and he was talking about like, because he would say it and then he would go, boys, you know what I'm talking about. And so it set this like narrative of like, oh, all men want this.
I mean, yeah, like the 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 churches that have the most abuse are typically in non-denominational or congregationalist churches that have little to no oversight and little to no like consequences. There's no kind of accountability in
Yes.
motion. And they also tend to, so that's kind of that supervision side of things, but then they also tend to have a very conservative, very purity culture mindset about sexuality that actually ends up over sexualizing
Yep.
teenagers. Like, it's funny, like I thought about sex all the time as a teenager
Oh
because
my gosh. Yeah.
I was afraid to think about sex. I was like so afraid that I was
It's
turning
literally
somebody
looking at someone and saying, "Don't think about a purple dog," and then all they're gonna think about all day is the purple
purple
dog
dog.
because you put it in their head.
Yep, absolutely. Um, I just remember maybe 6 months ago. Do you remember the youth pastor who got fired because he passed out stickers to his youth that said "I heart hot youth pastors"? Do you remember this story?
Yes, because I had students come to me later and be like, "What is your thought on this?" Because my students also knew that I had spicy takes, and I was
Mhm.
like, "That is not funny." Like, one of them was like, "You can buy it online." I'm like, "Don't. Do not. It's not funny. It's not okay. It's not cool. Like, don't do that." That was, oh my gosh. That
Do you know
story disturbed me so bad.
Yeah, do you know the whole story? Because it's kind of wild. So, like he gave that out because, in his words, "I heart hot moms" was like the big thing that was going around, and I guess that's Post Malone. Is it Post Malone that loves hot
Yeah,
moms?
that sounds familiar.
Uh-huh. And so apparently his youth thought "I heart moms" were funny. And so he made the "I heart hot youth pastors." But he had been at this church for less than a year. He was
Mhm.
35, single.
Mhm.
Not that there's anything wrong with that, but he had served at several churches over the course of his tenure, which it is a red flag to hop from church to church to church. That is a red flag.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's circumstantial. I get it. It happens. But it can be a red flag. And apparently uh in his first some like in the first few months, he decided to just drop on his students that he used to be addicted to pornography. And the elders at this church, and I think it was a Baptist church, so still conservative theology, where maybe this could have been appropriate, but they
Yeah.
had a red flag about it. Good for you, Baptists. Way to have a red flag
Yeah.
for once. Um,
Oh my gosh.
I grew up Baptist, so I can say that. So they had a red flag and they actually told him, no, you cannot just talk about pornography or sex with students without first sending out
Mm.
an email to parents warning them of sexual content in that week's message. Good for you, Baptist.
Absolutely.
And so he had
Rare
got
Baptist win.
yes. So he had already gotten in trouble for that, and then these stickers. And so I'm pretty sure he was probably fired from his church, and probably his whole future, his whole career ruined for these two things that might have been innocent mistakes. I honestly just can't imagine a 35-year-old making those mistakes. I say as a 33-year-old.
That's a little weird. Like, you're already so far into you're so close. Like, I don't understand. You know what? I'm not even gonna go there because I'll
20
just say something controversial.
25 maybe, like, oh wow, like you're, yeah. But
Oh yeah,
I
like, oh, you're like early mid-20s. Yeah, that's a mistake. I could see you, especially men. You know,
yeah,
that's like such a man
not
mistake.
me at 25, but a
Yeah,
man maybe.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just like, again, it's like the story of a few, and now everyone's calling him a groomer. People are saying all these things about him, and maybe he is, maybe he's
Yeah,
not, but he certainly made some stupid ass mistakes.
yeah, he did. Well, and and it goes into that's another grooming tactic too, is like making this behavior seem normal.
Yeah.
It's like because you are when you are in any sort of leadership role at a church, you are the example that you're setting for your students. And whatever is happening with you, that is what they see as normal. That is how they're supposed to model their life to be like later. And so the way that I practiced youth ministry was so different from everyone else when I was doing ministry because I was honest about certain topics and everything. I was honest about, hey, I was in an abusive relationship when I was a teenager and it got really bad. And I never went into the details of what kind of abuse. I would just tell them, yeah, I was abused and it was bad. Um, and I would be honest with them that I'm not perfect and that I was struggling with depression and anxiety and I was struggling with different things. But I never went into there's definitely boundaries that need to be had because that can be a murky water when you start opening up about your life. And I think there needs to be a middle ground because some pastors are like, you don't tell them anything, you don't share anything about your life. They don't even need to know like what your dog's name is. Like they're super
Mm.
like locked down on everything because they don't want the students to get to know them well. And then I know of like one pastor like long time ago. He was a youth pastor and he would have students over at his house whenever they wanted to pop over and he would give them beer. Like stuff like that. There needs to be a middle ground of like, yeah, you know about some of the things I've gone through, but you don't know about the things that you don't need to know about yet. Like you don't need to
Mm.
know that, my sexual issues when I was a teenager. You don't need to know about any of that. You don't need to know about my sex life between me and my wife. Which that's another thing is pastors nowadays are way too cavalier with how they talk about their wives from the pulpit. It's really weird. It's gross.
Yeah, I think Mark Driscoll really popularized a lot
Oh
of
my
that.
gosh,
I know we
yeah.
don't even need to. But speaking of stickers and pets, I would give my youth they could win um stickers of my pets, and they would put stickers of my pets like in their
Yeah,
Bible or in their lockers or whatever, but it was like an appropriate way for them to get to know me. And like
yeah,
I have a one-eyed cat. She's pretty famous with the youth. So um
yeah,
so but that's like appropriate stickers, guys.
yeah. No, exactly. Like an appropriate amount of like knowing who your youth pastor is. Like my youth kids got to know my boyfriend really well. and they loved him and they were friends with him, and he did end up becoming a leader to like kind of help with the boys. And one of my youth pastor friends, he would bring his dog to youth group with the
Mhm.
parents' permission, and the kids that had autism or anxiety or anything could sit with the dog during the sermon. It was really great. I think that's a great way to like blend your personal life with your ministry life, not talking about the intimate details of your relationship from the pulpit, or talking about things that you struggle with that kids don't even need to know about yet. Like the talking about pornography thing shouldn't even be discussed until at least like late high school with parental permission,
Yes.
because many kids, I know for me, like pornography was something that was talked about so often that it made me curious about it.
Mhm.
It gave me a ton of curiosity. I'm going to be like candid. I've never talked about this publicly before. It made me so curious that during my grooming time as a way, and I've talked with this about with my therapist extensively. Um, when I was being actively groomed and I was sexually abused, the way to like take autonomy of my body was going to pornography. And I didn't do that before I was groomed, but I knew that it was something that people do. And I
Mhm.
knew that it was something that was fun and exciting. That was like you could indulge in it because so many youth pastors talked about it when I was a teenager, that this was a thing to do. And it's interesting also because when you're fighting a pornography addiction, as a woman in the church, that is not something that happens
Yep.
that the church talks about, and so later, when I was in like college and career ministry, and I was like in my late teens, early 20s, before I had like taken a break from volunteering from ministry at this time. And it was before I really got into ministry, and I was really struggling, and I went to somebody and they actually said women don't deal with that. And I was like, do they though? Because I guess I must be broken then. And it just like added so much more stuff. But it really, to get back to like the point of youth ministry though, it really disturbs me how much, because we keep talking about these issues, it almost normalizes it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's really just because pornography addiction should not be the normal.
Yeah.
But we've made it the normal because we keep talking about it as if it's normal to struggle with that, especially to young men. And I get called a man hater a lot because I say things like that. And every time I'm like, no, I just want men to do better. I think they can do better. I have such high hopes for men that you don't have to be this way. And I have those hopes because I met my current significant other, and he's nothing like I was taught men were going to be. And I was like, this is a healthy, well-adjusted man who does not have a sex addiction. Did not know those existed, but here we are.
Well, because it's like it's a permissible sin. I mean, and I think that's why a lot of youth pastors share that part of their testimony, because it's a permissible masculine sin. It is masculine that,
It makes you more of a man to struggle with that.
yeah, because when I tell my story, and I don't always share detail, like when I tell my story to teenagers, I'm like, yeah, my parents struggle with addiction. Well, will look at you as, wow, you're probably pretty broken, right, that your parents struggle with addiction. But if I'm a
Yeah.
man and I told them I struggle with pornography, they'd be like, well, that's a manly man to have struggled with
Yeah.
that. That's a
Yeah, like of
good.
course you deal with that. It reminds me of the song The Man by Taylor Swift, where she
Yes.
gets to that bridge and she's talking about all the things that men do that are technically toxic, but they're held up as like, manhood and masculinity. And then when she does it, it's like this awful evil thing that she's doing.
Mhm.
And I also think too, like the conversation with pornography, like you said, it's a masculine sin, which means when women indulge in it, it's a problem. It also goes into like women need to be virgins by the time they're married, but you don't hear that as much about men.
No, no, no. I heard about a former pastor friend of mine. His wife would joke that he got like a lot of chicks in college before he met her. And it was like it was a non-toxic
Yeah.
church culture as far as sexuality goes. Like that was
Yeah.
totally fine. But I wondered to myself, if it was a female pastor and her male spouse said that about her, like, oh my gosh, she got so many dudes in college, that wouldn't have
Woo.
happened. Yeah, yeah, that would have been
Yeah.
like, oh, so she was a whore?
Yeah,
A
exactly. Oh, she was a
harlot?
slut?
Right.
What?
Right.
Yeah, no, that always bothers me too. Is like women are expected to be this like perfect, chaste, pure purity. It's women almost gatekeeping sexuality is like the task that we're given as teenagers is,
Yes.
men are sex craved monsters that will do anything they can to get their fill, and we as women have to dress a certain way and talk a certain way and act a certain way and look a certain way in order to make sure that we don't incite this monster in them. And if we do incite this monster and they do something terrible, it's our fault for not stopping it.
Hmm.
And that creates a lot of problems. And again, that goes into not just like talking, making talking about sexual topics in a inappropriate way, but it also there's a term called grooming the community,
Hmm.
where the predator will get the family and community into a place where they trust him so explicitly that if something does happen and the victim comes forward, they're not going to believe the victim.
Yep.
They'll take the side of the predator. And that happens more often in churches than it should, far more often in churches than it should. And that's what's really making churches unsafe for women and children right now. Churches are toxic to men too, but they're not unsafe to men.
Yes.
And I think that's the biggest thing that needs to be discussed right now. Like my significant other, Austin, he's a deconstructed Christian like I am. He grew up in church. He actually grew up in the Catholic Church. And for him, he didn't go through like the sexual abuse and the purity culture and all of that I went through, but he dealt with his fair share of church abuse, and he dealt with church hurt, but he wasn't actively in danger in the church like I was. And I think that's something that people don't talk about either. Women who aren't safe in the church, they're not going to stay in the faith like you want them to. They're going to deconstruct. They're going to leave for their safety. And there's not, unless you change the church environment, the modern Christian church in America, the modern Western church in America, is going to start dying out because women are the heart of the church. Women are the heart of everything.
Hmm.
Without women, there is nothing. And that sounds like super feminazi, but it's true. We are the mothers, we are the wives, we are the ones that are pushing everything. Women are more financially responsible than men statistically.
Hmm.
Women are more women tend to be more what's the word I'm looking for? I had a word and I lost it. It'll pop in my head at the end of the interview and I'll shout it. But women tend to be more resilient. That's what it is.
Hmm.
Women are more resilient than men typically in a lot of situations. And when we start treating women poorly, when we start treating their children poorly, that's when things start falling apart, because now women are going to do what they can to protect their children.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry for ranting.
No, you never have to apologize. I'm queen of ranting. Yeah, I mean, I think to summarize what Sydney's saying is fire all men, hire only women. I'm just kidding. Sydney Twitchell.
No, no, no. No, 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 no.
I'm just kidding.
My dad will see this podcast and be like, oh, my daughter, because he's like super fundamentalist conservative still. And it's really funny. He went on a rant about the Barbie movie the other day and was
I'm
like,
seeing it
women,
tonight.
he's like, women shouldn't go to this movie. And, it's going to put like these messages are harmful and toxic to young women and everything. And I was just sitting there listening. And at the end of it, I just looked at Austin, and Austin was like, we're still going dressed as Ken and Barbie, but thanks for your input, Mr. Twitchell. Like,
That's great. That's great.
oh,
So,
man.
as we, wrap up this podcast episode, I think that, you just did a good job, but I'd love for you to share something pointed at women. It could be a word of encouragement. It could be something you've been thinking about lately. It's very open-ended. What is something that you want women listening to hear?
God has called you to so much more than any man can think, than any man can expect, than any woman can expect in your life. There are people that are going to tell you you can't do it because you're a woman. That's just the society that we live in. But I want women to know that if God has called you to it, there's nothing anybody can say or do about it that's going to stop you, because it's from God, it's not from you. You don't have to take orders from man and from their opinions when you are destined to do something that God has put on your heart. And I want women to know that you can accomplish whatever God sets before you.
Mm. Well, thank you, Sydney, so much for sharing that and for sharing a little bit about your story today. And, I'm just really passionate about this topic because having grown up in the Southern Baptist Church, I knew some people on that list that came out a few years ago.
Oh,
And
fun.
yeah, and it's crazy because the Southern Baptist Church is fighting about women being in ministry when they should be focused on getting our predators out of our churches. And it
Mm-hmm.
just feels like that's very indicative of where we're at in church culture right now. We're focused, and honestly, American politics, we're focused on these things that are really non-issues, or are issues, but certainly don't move the ship where it needs to go, when really we need to be thinking about how do we correct and repent for a lot of the crap that is really holding the church back from her potential. And this is one of
Amen.
those things. If we get supervision in our churches, if we get better youth leaders, if we have enough barriers that predators stay out of our churches, then this can move our church forward. This is it. And we have to spend time on that, or the church is going to die. And us
Absolutely.
deconstructing angry Christians are just going to say, no, absolutely not. Just
Amen.
is what it is. All
Yeah.
right. So, Sydney, what we're going to do is we're going to link in the show notes ways to connect with you on the internets. You can definitely follow her at Nerdy Youth Pastor. And I hope that you get to be a Jedi warrior soon.
Yeah, that should be coming up by the end of the year.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on, and thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next week.